Okay, good afternoon everyone. Welcome to this Advanced Steel webinar where we're going to be looking at the Advanced Steel and Revit collaborative workflows. My name's Rob Merriman. I'm one of the application engineers within the structures team here at Greytec. I've been working in the steelwork and metalwork industry since I left university, working as a draftsman for 7 years before joining Greytec. As an application engineer at Greytec, my primary focus is training, support and customization of Advanced Steel, but within the last year or so I've been expanding my knowledge of the AEC collection, and with Autodesk doing more with the workflows between Revit and Advanced Steel, it's something we are expanding into, so we've been working quite hard over the last year to get our head around how these workflows and how they can benefit you guys. If you do have any questions on today's webinar or anything else relating to Advanced Steel or structures within Revit, please reach out to me. My email address is on the front screen here. My Twitter handle is there, and you can find me on LinkedIn as well. And all of that contact information is on the handout for the webinar as well. So before we get started, we'll just quickly run over the previous webinars that we, the structures team, have done this January. So in case anyone is interested in them. John Bennett did an Advanced Steel and Plant 3D collaboration. Tommy and Sarah did a Revit Advanced Design and Advanced Steel workflow webinar. Tommy then did another webinar with Advanced Steel and an MIS solution. So that is our Advanced Workshop solution. And then Tommy also did a webinar on the Advanced Steel drawing customization for the plant industry. And finally, this morning, I did a webinar on Advanced Steel with the additional data that the Power Pack gives you. Our marketing team are still working on getting these uploaded. So if you do want the links to the recording, please contact marketing@greytec.com. And when everything's been uploaded, they will send them out to you. And today's webinar is going to be a brief overview of the workflows between Advanced Steel and Revit. John Bennett and I did a series of 4 webinars in August and September last year, which we went into more detail on. So I have embedded the links into the handout so that you can get a copy of that recording. So I did a structural steel for Revit users, just going through the new steel tab in Revit 2019. John did Revit to Advanced Steel Collaboration Part 1, where he went into the mechanisms and how everything worked and why it works. We broke that down into 2 parts. And then finally, I did a webinar on, once you've got a model from Revit to Advanced Steel, some of the checking tools that we can do to make sure that everything that we've done has been modeled correctly. So just some extra webinars there in case anyone missed them. So an overview of what we're going to look at today. We're going to look at the Advanced Steel extension for Revit, the SMLX transfer, what will transfer, what are the differences between all the various versions. Then we'll look at the actual extension settings. Then we're going to look at some Advanced Steel to Revit testing, and then finally some Revit to Advanced Steel testing. And after that, I will run a synchronization on a simple model just to show you that it's not just finished models that we can send back and forth. So the Advanced Steel extension for Revit. Start with Advanced Steel. In Advanced Steel, you don't have to download anything. All the import, export, synchronization are already installed and comes as part of the standard Advanced Steel. Just make sure this is recording. Yes, it is. And in Revit, so before 2019, the extension needs to be downloaded from the Revit App Store. Just search for Steel and download the correct version. As you can see from that screenshot, there's obviously different extensions for different versions. And it's always best just to ensure your Revit's closed before installing add-in, same with Advanced Steel. So the 2019 version isn't in the Revit store. It's actually downloaded straight from your Autodesk account. So if you go to manage.autodesk.com, obviously log in and then go to your product updates, you will see the Advanced Steel extension for Revit 2019. So that's where you get it in the 2019 version. So once it's installed, it's located under the add-ins tab, and it's the Advanced Steel extension. So then we've got obviously export, import, synchronization, and the settings. So we'll go through all of that today. So what will transfer? So I'm not going to go through every option within every table in every version. This presentation has been printed as a PDF and put in the handout so you guys can download it. The main sort of areas to cover are the 2019 version. They added so much more, mainly due to the fact that there is now a steel tab in Revit, so it recognizes a lot more things. So if we look at the connection elements, so these are just the individual elements. So in 16, 17 and 18, bolts, anchors, shear studs and welds wouldn't go backwards and forwards. Whereas in 19, you can now model bolts, anchors, shear studs and welds and holes within Revit. So they are now Revit elements that will transfer backwards and forwards. Revit 2019 now as well, can see in here the plate and beam features. It will recognize those, so we can now send shortenings and cuts and copes and things like that between the two of them. So the Advanced Steel extension settings, there are different settings within each version of Revit. Obviously, as Autodesk have been working on it through the various versions, they've changed certain bits and pieces. So you'll see that we've got 16, 17, 18 and 19 options, and you can see that there are more in the 16 ones and then less in the 19 ones. That's not because they've taken any of those features away. They've just rolled them actually into the extension. So for example, if we look at 16, you could choose whether you imported plates or not. On 19, that's just included within the extension, so everything imports straight away. So we'll just go through an explanation of some of those settings. So update section mapping on import, that is a 2016 option only. This saves the one-to-one section mapping into a database. So when you export from Advanced Steel or Revit, sometimes you have to actually do the mapping if each system doesn't recognize the sections. In 16, you could control whether that was saved or not. In all the other versions, it's saved automatically for you. Disable joins for beams. So within Revit, if we had the top of a roof like this, the two beams would join automatically, whereas they won't in Advanced Steel. So you can turn that off if you want to put connections in there. Beam shortenings, when you're modeling in Revit, the beams automatically shorten. So if we look at the bottom left image here, the beams are actually drawn to the node of the column in here, but they recognize where the web is, and that is called a shortening in Advanced Steel. So when you export, you can export the beam shortenings or not. Export custom profiles as dynamic. So this is where John Bennett went into a lot more detail of how it exports everything. But basically, if you have a custom family in Revit, if you don't have the corresponding section in Advanced Steel, it will export it, and you can export it as a dynamic profile so that you don't need to have those sections existing in Advanced Steel already. It generates it on the export. Like I said, we've given you the links to the group of webinars that me and John did in August, September time, where John goes into a lot more detail of how that export works. The export based on view settings is fairly self-explanatory. It will only export what is shown within the Revit view. So rather than me waffling on anymore, let's actually go and do some importing and exporting. So what we're going to do, we are going to start with Advanced Steel. So this might be something that if you're an Advanced Steel user, your clients are not just asking for the fabrication drawings and GA drawings and 3D views, they're now actually asking you for Revit files. And if you have an AEC collection, you get Revit and Advanced Steel and a whole host of other softwares such as Navisworks. So you can create Revit files for your clients. So everything in here has been finished. I've got a staircase in there. I've got a little bit of grating in there. That staircase has got some folded treads on it. So just to show you that we can import and export all of this. So in Advanced Steel, I'm just going to go to the Export and Import tab, and we're just going to export. We'll put this onto the desktop, and we will call it Webinar, so I know exactly which one it is. And you see in the bottom right it's exporting, and it will just pop up when it's finished and say it'll warn me that it needs to save. It should do. I haven't changed anything, so it's not going to bring me that message. So that has now exported. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start a new Revit project, and we're going to start a structural template. There's a couple of little bits I'm going to do. What I will do, I'll do these, and then while the import is working, I'll just run through what I've done and why I've done it. So I'm just going to go to a 3D view. So I'm going to go to the the add-ins tab. I've got my Advanced Steel extension, and I'm simply going to import. Now, when you import, it automatically defaults to Advanced Import, which is the SMLX file. So that's the steel markup language. So we'll choose the webinar option, and we'll just let this import. So this is going to take 2 or 3 minutes. So I'll just waffle on a little bit as to what I did when I opened that Revit structure file. So that is the out-of-the-box Revit structural template. I haven't done any customization to it whatsoever, just so you can see what you get out of the box. If you're doing this a lot, what we would advise is you actually start setting up a template for importing the Advanced Steel models into. What I did, I went to an elevation view and I deleted the level 2, because with the Advanced Steel to Revit extension and the SMLX file, if I go back to my Advanced Steel model, I do have in here levels. So I've got 2 mezzanine, which is at 2.5 meters. So I don't want that to conflict with any Revit levels that are in there, because it will import all of that information as well. So that's why I just cleared that out, just so you don't get any conflicting information. So it's just going through. You can see it slowly being built, so it's just importing everything. So we'll just wait for that to finish. I don't have any colors or anything set up, so it is just going to be in a 2D wireframe that I'll show you everything today, but I'll show you what happens when we import everything. Everything in my Advanced Steel file has been done with standard Advanced Steel connections. So if we look in here, I can go to Joint Properties. This is a single-sided end plate connection, so it will do the shortening. It will weld the plate on for me automatically. It will put the bolts on automatically for me. Now, in all the different versions of Revit, these connections do actually exist. So in Revit 2016 and 17, I believe they put 22 of the most basic connections in, so end plates, base plates, that kind of thing. And then 17 and 18 and 19, they've increased the amount of connections within the system. So in Revit, you have about 180 steel connections. So it doesn't just export the plates and the shortenings and the bolts as individual elements. It actually exports them as steel connections. So if you did need to modify anything in the Revit file, you can modify those connections within the Revit file. So we'll just wait for this to finish. But as you can see in here, we are getting these green circles. So these are all my connections. The reason they show up as green circles is because I'm in level of detail medium. If I go to coarse, we just see our lines, our analytical lines and our beams, and we just see the circles for the connection. So what you want to always be is you want to be in level of detail fine, and we'll just go to a hidden view. And you can see that everything is imported. And if I click on this, this has imported as a connection. So I can click on the Modify Parameters button on my Modify tab, and you'll see that it's called Nia frame bolted with haunch. So I can then start to modify that connection, and it will update everything in here automatically. So that has brought everything across. If we go back to my south elevation, you can see that it's automatically brought my advanced steel level through correctly. It has as well brought the entire staircase through. Now that staircase had folded plates. Advanced Steel 19 does recognize folded plates. And it's also brought through all the connections, all the bolts, all the welds in there. So in the 19 version, pretty much everything does come through. Obviously, as you go back through the versions, if you refer back to that table, certain things will come through and won't come through. So that is if you're an Advanced Steel user and you need to create a Revit file, or someone's asking you for a Revit file. It's a lot better format than an IFC, because these are just registered as actual Revit beams, not IFC beams, so we can start modifying them if needed in here. The same with the concrete. They're all recognized as concrete footings, concrete beams, concrete walls, so you can start using the Greytec concrete add-on if you have it to start doing all your reinforcement if you needed to. So that's going from Advanced Steel to Revit. Now a common workflow is the other way. So we'll have a look at the workflow going from Revit to Advanced Steel. So as a general example, this would be if the main engineer, the engineer for the project, and the architect, they've positioned the steels where they need them, but they haven't connected anything up. That then is your job as the steel detailer to actually put the connections on, put the staircases in, the railings, any miscellaneous metalwork that the architect and engineer don't go into that level of detail for. So what you don't want to do is you don't want to have to model all of this from scratch. You want to be able to bring everything in where they're setting out their section sizes, their geometry, and then it saves you a lot of time in the setting out. So we'll just go to add-ins. We'll have a look at settings, because I've already got it set up, but I don't want anything to export as a custom profile. I don't want any custom profiles exported dynamically. The reason that I don't have to do any mapping is these Revit families. If I go to edit type and we have a look in here, there is some identity data. There's a section name key. Now all of these Revit families have been set up with this section name key. What that does is when we export to Advanced Steel, that correlates to all of the databases within Advanced Steel, so you don't have to do the mapping of every section every time you want to import like you would with an IFC file. So if you get, we actually had this as a support case on Friday. A client had been given an IFC file from Revit, and let's say, for example, there were 20 different sections in there. When you import that IFC file, you have to map each one of the 20 sections to the correct database in Advanced Steel. Once you have done it once, that is set up for your Advanced Steel, but it does take about 20 seconds per section. So if you've got 20, or if you've got an even bigger model with 50 or 100 sections in, that can take a long time. It turns out the client had modeled everything in Revit as Revit elements, even with some steel connections in there. So we went through this exact workflow to export it via the Advanced Steel add-in, and it brought the entire model through straight away. So if we go add-ins, just make sure nothing is selected, we'll go export. We'll export it as the advanced export, and we'll put this on the desktop as that file. So that has now created an SMLX file on my desktop. So we'll start a new Advanced Steel template. It's important you start with an Advanced Steel template, not just an AutoCAD template, because there are layers and hard coding behind the template for your Advanced Steel objects. So we'll just go to a Southwest isometric view, and we'll go to realistic. So we'll go to the Export and Import tab, and then we'll import from Revit. On my desktop, we'll click Open. The only thing you might have to map, and it won't do it for me, I put a clean set of data in this morning. In Revit, there are certain materials. So we have metal, steel 43275. That material doesn't exist in Advanced Steel. So what this is asking me for is every element that is metal, steel 43275, what do I want to convert it to in Advanced Steel? So these are all my Advanced Steel materials. So I'll map this to S275JR, and I'll probably get a pop-up for the concrete. So default wall, we'll just put it in as one of the C's. We'll put it in as C30. Now these mappings are stored in a database and it won't ask you this every time. So once I've done that mapping, if you just click a random section, it will do that mapping every time. So if I start another new file, and I re-import, you see this time it hasn't asked me to map the material grades, and it's mapping to a 275JR. So that is set up in databases. If you do make mistakes, we can go in and delete those entries from the databases, but just something to be aware of. Don't just click OK on every one, because that mapping will take effect on every model you import from then on. So what I'll do, I will just save this as imported from Revit, so we know what we've done with it. So you can see it's brought the walls in, and they are now Advanced Steel walls. It's brought the grids in, and they are Advanced Steel grid lines. And it's brought, obviously, the beams and the columns, and they are Advanced Steel beams and columns. So they're not IFC beams or IFC elements. They are exporting from, if you go from Revit to Advanced Steel, they go from Revit beams to Advanced Steel beams. Obviously, if you go the other way, the same happens. Now, the only thing to bear in mind is in the 2019 version, I can't turn off the export of shortenings. And if I go to put a connection on here, if I put a single-sided connection on, I will get two shortenings. So if I did a model check on this beam, so these are just some of the Advanced Steel checking tools, should have told me that I have overlapping shortenings. So in theory, if that beam got sent as an NC file, it would want to put two cuts in it. You can see there I've deleted the connection, but it's left the shortening from my Advanced Steel, from my Revit export, sorry. So what I'm just going to do is go to a wireframe. I'm just going to tidy that up. I'm going to draw a window around everything. Go to my selection filters tab, and we have a filter for beam features. So that's all the features selected. I'm just going to delete those so that all of my beam elements are now noding out again. You can see that, like when I went from Advanced Steel to Revit, it brought the levels through in my Revit model. If we have a look what I have set up in here, I've got foundation, ground, first, second, and mezzanine, just hiding in there. They have brought through as they are now Advanced Steel levels. So we can start to isolate the areas of the model that we're working on, just like we would in Revit. So what I'm going to do, so that is the export the other way, so from Revit to Advanced Steel. What we would then do as steel detailers is obviously populate this model with the steel connections, run the fab drawings, get it sent out into the workshop. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to put a few steel connections on, and then the last part of today's webinar, we will synchronize it back with our Revit file. I don't want to do that, so we'll just put a base plate on. I'm not going to associate it with concrete today. We'll just put a few connections on and copy them around just to show you that how we can copy things around multiple times with the association. So we'll just tidy this up a little bit. Okay, we'll make that, we'll go 200 that way, 200 that way, 100 that way, and 100 that way. A little bit small, but that's okay. We'll just put some and we'll go 80 that way. So what I can then do, I can copy that round multiple times just by selecting the columns. And that has now put that base plate on every column for me. What we'll do, we'll just put a couple of connections on the top here, and then we'll send it back to Revit with those connections on. So we'll look a little bit heavier on that section, and we'll put 3 in there. That'll do. And again, I'll copy that connection around multiple times. So what I'm doing here is just selecting the main beams. And then what I'm going to do is just select all the beams that connect into those. Might look a little heavy on those small sections, but for a demonstration it'll be fine. And what that will do, that will put those connections, so it looks a little bit silly there, it's quite a bit too big, but you can see that using some of the advanced steel tools we can populate the model very, very quickly with the joints. What we'll do, just to show you another one, we'll put a double-sided end plate connection in here, just to show you that it will send the bolts through both plates. So what I'm going to do, we'll just save this file. So the last little bit of today's webinar will just synchronize back to this Revit model that doesn't have any connections on. So what we'll do, we will export. We'll call that out. So we're going back the other way. Let that export. We'll come to Revit, we'll go to our add-ins, the Advanced Steel extension, and we'll go to synchronization. So what we'll get another dialog here where we can load in the SMLX file. It will then compare everything between the two models, and this is where you can see that some things have been modified, so it knows that I've changed the material on the beams and the columns when I was mapping. So this is why, if you go back and look at the longer webinars that John and I did, we do recommend that if you're modeling in Revit and you're doing lots of steel work, you actually create an S275JR material, and then we won't have all of these material changes. What I can do is, it knows it's putting these connections on, so I can select those, tick the button, and then click Apply All Actions. Even though I've ticked Apply All Actions because I've got just the connections ticked, it will just go through and populate that model with those connections. I don't know if you can see it, just a couple of bolts appear in there, so we'll just give it a second to come back to us. You do have to be patient with the synchronize, which is why if you are sending a huge model, we sort of think it's best practice to have, okay, so it's actually warning me that I have two connections on top of each other, which if I went back to my advanced steel, just while that's importing, that's the way I copied that joint around. In advanced steel, we do have checking tools. So it's telling me that I've got 3 sets of bolts and 2 end plates clashing with each other. So I've got a double joint in here, basically. Click OK on that. So that is the synchronization. So now we can see all of those connections have come through as, again, they are connections in Revit, which can be found in the Steel tab, and Revit recognizes them as connections. And then in here we have that double-sided end plate. So today, that is the sort of end of a brief overview of the collaborative workflows between Revit and Advanced Steel. If you do have any questions, like I said, you can either ask them now, or you can email me with the contact information there and in the handout. And if you do have any questions about workflows or training for these kind of workflows, or even using the Steel tab within Revit, please reach out to us, because we do have courses to cover everything. What I'll do, I will leave the webinar running for a couple of minutes, just in case any questions do pop up. And if not, I hope you found today enjoyable, and keep an eye out for the structures webinars coming up in the future. So thank you very much.